I hear rumors from all my contacts that there's an avalanche of macro hedge funds coming into the space, setting up accounts, like an increase by almost an order of magnitude. It used to be there was one or two macro traders. And now I think a lot of hedge funds are setting up accounts, and their view is we have to trade this stuff. Whether or not they'll stand up and say, I want to hold $1 billion or $10 billion of it for a decade, well, we're still waiting for that. But it seems like at the end of the year, at the end of 2021, I heard all sorts of stories that, conventional macro funds yielded 3 or 4% ROI in the year, and crypto hedge funds had 500% returns in the year, and 200% returns, and some at 1,000% returns, and 100% returns. So if there's anything that people understand on Wall Street, it's money. And someone made 10 or 100x as much trading that volatility. Whether or not I'm ready to marry this asset, I'm sure that I want to trade, and I want to be engaged. I can't afford to ignore this. And that's kind of the message that we're hearing even from the big bulge bracket banks on Wall Street, that, I'll paraphrase them, this is not going away.
I think those are the big ones. I think I'm watching stablecoin space pretty closely, and then I'm watching the international area. I'm watching what Europe does. I'm watching what India does, some of these larger markets. And I think so far it's moving in the right direction. I think we also, we also need to see clarification around, say, how regulators view Bitcoin's energy policy. I think, there's still a lot of education happening in that space. So Bitcoin faces less of the risks around, say, being labeled a security, like some of the other tokens face, but it's kind of uniquely singled out for its energy footprint. And I think as we, now we have multiple publicly traded miners. I think also one of the things I would look for is more announcements from utilities about integrating Bitcoin as, say, a load balancer as a way to monetize stranded energy production. Because what we've seen is you have the Bitcoin Mining Council quarterly updates, and there's been a number of them. A number of the CEOs of mining companies talk about that utilities are interested in the space, that they're researching the space, but we have not seen a lot of utilities come out with announcements and things like that. And I think it's interesting because you see it from multiple angles. On one hand, say stranded natural gas, instead of being flared or vented in the atmosphere, can be used for productive purposes. And then two, we see that in these kind of these intermittent sources of renewable production like wind, solar. Bitcoin is a way to stabilize and monetize their periods where they're maybe producing more energy than is needed compared to having less energy that is needed. And I think that's still being kind of worked through, I think, in terms of the public's cognition of that. But I think as we look out a couple of years, that's another milestone to watch, is how energy regulators, policymakers, and mainly I think the companies involved treat Bitcoin and kind of work with Bitcoin and use it for their purposes.
Which is, what's the current political outlook for Bitcoin? Why don't we start with developed world versus developing world? What do you see as the political drivers in the developing world versus developed with regard to Bitcoin?
Well, in the developing world, it's interesting because if you look, NYDIG and others, they've shown, I think Chainalysis did this. NYDIG had it in one of their reports showing the level of adoption in different countries. And generally, you see that some of the higher inflation developing countries have some of the highest levels of Bitcoin adoption, which shouldn't be that surprising. We were talking about inflation being at 7% while yields are at 0%. And that's one of the better currencies out there, the dollar. So imagine if you're in an environment where you're underbanked or unbanked, and you're dealing with double-digit currency inflation, but you have a mobile phone, as over 4 billion people have now, and so they can hold Bitcoin, for example, and for them, obviously they're still dealing with the volatility of Bitcoin, but they have a stronger incentive to latch on to that type of property, I think, than it's more apparent to them. It's quicker hitting them than it does in some of the developed markets that I think they feel they have. It's less kind of in their face.
I suspect they might do 180 and turn around at some point, just like certain other regimes have. But I suppose right now the primary dynamic has been just this China exodus and massive dislocation. Let's talk about.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think basically, yeah, I think they're maybe sacrificing some long-term, optionality for short and intermediate-term management, and that might prove to be very short-sighted in the long run.
They love the idea of a cryptocurrency, or at least a stable CBDC currency in the CNY, although I don't think that they have credibly put forth one that is being used as a medium of exchange outside of China. And on the other hand, the clear winner of cryptocurrency is the US dollar stablecoin, either in the form of Tether or Circle. And I suspect that if you look at the 8 billion people on the planet, everybody wants dollars, even everybody in China. I bet you that in China, the 2 billion people in that sphere of influence, they would also take stable USD. And the way we know this, actually, the acid test is the fact that the Chinese have capital controls. And if they drop the capital controls, the CNY would go awry and huge amounts of capital would flow out of their country, right? That you wouldn't have to fight to keep people from transferring capital if they didn't want to. I would expect the UAE, given its track record, they pride themselves on being very forward-thinking, mobile, internet savvy. I think that you might see some kind of clear guidance from them. And of course, the 800-pound gorilla is what happens on Capitol Hill in the United States with regard to this. But I think we can look forward to a lot more political conversations that include discussion of Bitcoin, and by inference and by implication, they're all accelerating the adoption of the asset class. No one's talking about things that are irrelevant to life.
So I would say two things are really appearing to me the most. One is the migration of the hash rate to the United States, and the introduction of publicly traded Bitcoin miners has been really fascinating to watch. Financing, to make, basically allow those companies to access capital has really improved in the past 2-3 years. A number of providers in the industry have tapped into that market. Now they have, in many cases, public capital to work with. And so I think that's a huge thing. We also see some of the mining hardware. So a lot of that is still made in China, but we're seeing announcements from companies like Blockstream, Block, and Intel about getting into that space more directly, the hardware side of it, from a North American point of view. And so I think that's one of the exciting things to watch. And then two, I think the Lightning Network is really fascinating. I think especially Elizabeth Stark and Lightning Labs has done a lot of tremendous work building out the back end, all the infrastructure that allows all these companies to integrate it, into their offering. And the way I would describe it is that Lightning now looks like Bitcoin looked in 2013, right? So we have this build out of a secondary layer, and it's a rather small team of individuals. Lightning Labs has, say, dozens of employees. You see the people at Blockstream working on it. They're independent developers, but it's tremendous how much they've been able to build, because the technology itself is so enabling, and basically there's so much energy in the space. I think that Bitcoin went through this phase of, it went through this early period where retailers would say, hey, we accept Bitcoin now. That didn't really catch on, because base layer Bitcoin transactions are not really meant for buying coffee, and people don't really want to part with such a high power asset. They don't want to do a taxable event every time they do something like that. But I think as Lightning builds out, that enables a lot of technologies, and basically sets this foundation. And I talked before about friction points, right? So early on, it was hard to buy Bitcoin. It was hard to interact with Bitcoin. And Lightning's gone through a similar pattern, of course, several years delayed. And so as, for example, Lightning Labs and these other providers roll out better and better tools, it becomes easier for companies to integrate it with it. It becomes easier for consumers to use it. And it can be used not just for transferring Bitcoin, it can also potentially be used for transferring other assets. It can be used for transferring information. And so we see, for example, Impervious is building on it. And so I'm kind of watching all these different milestones in the Lightning Network in particular.
Move other assets when it can move Bitcoin, but when it can also move a stable coin, a US dollar stable coin. I think that makes it something you would want to plug into billions and billions of devices and spread to 8 billion people in the world. And so that's a big deal. I think the idea of an open, permissionless, non-custodial monetary payment network, which is what Lightning represents, is maybe just as profound as TCP/IP or HTTP or SMTP or something. So it's a big deal, and it will then wake up the big tech companies, the Apples, the Facebooks, the Googles of the world. I don't think you can have a competitive mobile app if you don't build Lightning into it. You know, if you roll the clock forward a few years, it's just a matter of time. The Intel miner is a big deal. Hardware wallets and hardware miners are a big deal. And maybe one of the themes is publicly traded companies in the United States shipping Bitcoin hardware, Bitcoin devices, Bitcoin services, Bitcoin software. That's a big deal. That will accelerate adoption dramatically. If we start to see some of these offshore exchanges like Binance and FTX start to do more business in the US, that's a catalyst. I think there's $20 billion of crypto VC or more. That's massive amounts flowing in the space in the past 12 weeks. That's a catalyst. I agree with you on Bitcoin miners. I think I count about 24 publicly traded Bitcoin miners by the end of the quarter. And so, as I've said before, you get that many public companies, they're all holding their Bitcoin. They're not selling it. In fact, they're raising capital so they don't have to sell any. So the stock to flow is leaping. The amount of Bitcoin available for sale is falling. And I think that'll continue until the Bitcoin mining sector flips the stock to flow negative and they start net buying more Bitcoin than is being mined. And that makes this a really scarce asset. And it's something you can do with a scarcity like Bitcoin. It would make no sense with silver or gold or a commodity or oil.
So I think so right now we have the announcements like we talked about for some of these North American hardware producers. I think the launching of some of those hardware would be key milestones. It's harder to launch than it is to talk about launching. And so I think those are milestones to watch. I also think that any sort of new offering that happens on Lightning or things that catch on Lightning are worth watching. And so, for example, right now we think of Bitcoin as one thing, but Elizabeth Stark and others have pointed out for years that you can separate the idea of Bitcoin the asset and Bitcoin the network. And so these different technologies that harness Bitcoin the network, like for example, transferring dollar value, for example, I think that's a use case that's still underserved, and I think it's worth watching. I also think that basically, like I think you pointed out, basically more and more kind of hardware design. So you made the example of having a phone that has kind of a hardware wallet built into it, just instead of a mobile wallet, maybe a hardware wallet, things like that, more integrations. I'm interested to see products that Block might do and these other companies that have talked about catering to that market. And so I think anything that launches and that seems to be successful is a milestone worth watching.